top deadliest Apache warriors in the history of the American West. The United States Army spent 25 years, burned through over $40 million in the currency of the time, deployed a third of its entire national force, and still could not defeat a handful of Apache warriors who never fielded more than 80 men at once. 80. The country that had just won the Civil War with an army of over 1 million soldiers took a quarter century to capture fewer people than fit on a bus. The Apache were not just warriors, they were a force of nature with 2 legs, intimate knowledge of every rock in the desert, and a strategic patience that would make any European general weep with envy. This script is not about the savage Indians from Western movies. It is about the deadliest, most intelligent, and most resilient men who ever walked the American continent. The Army knew it. That is exactly why they tried to erase every one of these names from history. Cochise, the man who forced the United States to negotiate on its knees. Cochise was the leader of the Chiricahua Apache, and for 11 years he kept the territory that is now Arizona and New Mexico in a state of permanent warfare that the American Army simply could not win. It all started in 1861 when a lieutenant named George Bascom invited Cochise to a peace meeting and then tried to arrest him as a hostage. Cochise escaped by cutting through the side of the tent with a knife. The Americans thought they could intimidate an Apache warrior with a cheap trap. The result was a war that cost hundreds of lives and lasted over a decade. In 1872, the government sent General Oliver Howard, a one-armed man, to cross the most hostile desert on the continent and negotiate with Cochise. The same government that had spent years trying to exterminate the Chiricahua was now begging for peace. Howard secured a deal because Cochise demanded that his people receive their own territory in Arizona. The government accepted. Cochise died in 1874, never captured, never defeated in open battle. Cochise. The Bascom affair and the day everything exploded. Lieutenant George Bascom was 22 years old when he decided he could arrest the most powerful Apache warrior in the territory using a tent and an excuse. In February of 1861, Bascom invited Cochise to a meeting under a white flag, ordered soldiers to surround the tent, and declared that Cochise would only leave when he returned white children allegedly kidnapped by the Apache. The problem was that it was not Cochise who had kidnapped anyone. It was a different group. Cochise explained this calmly. Bascom did not believe him. Cochise tried to leave. The soldiers blocked the exit. Cochise then did what any experienced Apache warrior would do. He drew a knife, slashed through the tent canvas, and ran into the darkness while the soldiers were still trying to figure out what had happened. In the following days, Cochise captured American hostages for exchange. Bascom refused to negotiate. Both sides executed their hostages. That young idiot lieutenant had just triggered what became known as the Bascom affair, the spark that ignited an 11-year war. He was later promoted, naturally. Cochise, the stronghold nobody could take. In the Dragoon Mountains of Arizona, there was a granite and canyon labyrinth that Cochise knew like the back of his hand, and that the American Army never successfully penetrated. The Americans called it Cochise Stronghold, and it was not just a hiding place. It was a complete operations base from which Chiricahua warriors could strike the territory in any direction and vanish before soldiers could get close. The terrain favored the defenders so outrageously that attacking it was the equivalent of entering a house through the chimney. The Apache knew every passage, every trail, every water source. American soldiers entered the desert not knowing where the next well was, riding 800-pound horses carrying heavy equipment. Apache warriors ran on foot for dozens of miles carrying only the essentials. It was like sending a truck to chase a rabbit. Today, that place is an American government conservation area. The irony of preserving for tourists the same territory the Army spent decades trying to conquer is frankly inspiring. Geronimo, the most wanted man in America. In September of 1886, Geronimo surrendered to General Nelson Miles with 37 people total, counting women and children. The American Army had mobilized 5,000 soldiers, hired 500 allied Apache scouts, and spent nearly $1 million just in the final campaign to capture this group of 37 people. Do the math. Over 135 soldiers per person in Geronimo's group. The American government made a point of calling this a military victory. Geronimo was not a hereditary chief. He was a warrior who became a leader through pure combat competence and through surviving something that would have broken any ordinary human being. In 1858, Mexican soldiers massacred his mother, his wife, and his 3 children while he was in Ciudad Juarez buying supplies. Geronimo came back to camp and found only bodies. The man the Americans spent decades trying to capture started out as a father who came home too late. Geronimo, the man whose silhouette made soldiers freeze. Geronimo's real name was Goyale, which in Apache means the one who yawns. But Mexican soldiers who survived his attacks started shouting the name of St. Jerome in desperation during combat. That is where Geronimo came from, a nickname given by terrified enemies that ended up being the name the entire world would know him by. Geronimo was the last Apache leader to formally surrender to the United States Army in 1886, and even after the surrender, the American government was so frightened of his influence that they kept him as a prisoner of war for 23 years. 23 years. He never returned to Arizona. He lived the rest of his life as a prisoner in Oklahoma and Florida, participated in President Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration parade in 1905, and died in 1909, still technically a prisoner of war. The country that captured him did not even have the nerve to let him die free. To this day, Geronimo is the only American whose name is shouted by paratroopers before they jump. Geronimo, prisoner of war, American celebrity. While imprisoned at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Geronimo discovered something curious about Americans. They adored the man they had spent decades trying to kill. Geronimo began selling autographed photos of himself, hats, and bows at prices he set himself. He sold buttons from his own clothing for 25 cents each. Buttons. He did this frequently enough that his guard had to regularly sew new buttons onto his clothes. At the St. Louis Exposition of 1904, Geronimo was displayed as an attraction in the American government's pavilion, like a living trophy. He charged for each photo, each autograph, each interaction. He earned more money at that exposition than many free Americans made in months of work. The man was technically imprisoned and still found a way to extract money from the very Americans who kept him captive. It was not freedom, but it was, at minimum, irony executed with mastery. Victorio, the strategist who humiliated two armies simultaneously. Victorio was the leader of the Mimbres Apache. Between 1879 and 1880, he conducted a military campaign against the armies of the United States and Mexico simultaneously that military strategy textbooks still cannot properly explain. With a group that never exceeded 300 warriors, Victorio repeatedly defeated American forces, crossing into Mexico when the pressure became too great, striking Mexican forces, then crossing back when necessary. It was like playing chess on two boards at the same time while opponents barely knew a game was being played. American General Benjamin Grierson, a Civil War veteran, spent months trying to predict Victorio's movements without success. Victorio's strategy was simple in concept, but impossible to counter in practice. Never accept battle on unfavorable terms. Never stay in one place long enough to be surrounded. Use the terrain as a more reliable ally than any warrior. In October of 1880, Victorio was killed at Tres Castillos in Mexico by Mexican forces led by Colonel Joaquin Terrazas. Nana, the 80-year-old warrior who still terrified the army. After Victorio was killed at Tres Castillos in 1880, the American army must have thought the problem was solved. The replacement was an old Apache named Nana, who was approximately 80 years old, suffered from severe arthritis, and walked with a limp. In July of 1881, Nana led a group of at most 40 warriors on a 2-month raid through New Mexico, covering over 900 miles, winning at least 8 engagements against American forces, killing or wounding over 50 soldiers, capturing 200 horses, and vanishing back into Mexico. With 40 elderly and injured warriors. The United States Army mobilized 1,200 soldiers to catch this group. They failed. Nana finally surrendered with Geronimo in 1886 and died in Oklahoma in 1916 at over 100 years of age, having survived 2 armies, American imprisonment, and the American plan to exterminate his people. Arthritis did not bring him down. The American army did not bring him down. 200 years of colonization tried and failed. Mangas Coloradas, the leader the Americans murdered during peace negotiations. Mangas Coloradas, whose Apache name was De Soto High, was a Mimbres leader of impressive physical stature for the standards of his time, standing over 6 feet 2 inches tall. He was Cochise's father-in-law, and for decades was the most influential Apache leader in the entire American Southwest. In January of 1863, Mangas Coloradas went to Fort McLean in New Mexico under a white flag to negotiate peace with American authorities. General Joseph West ordered the sentinels, loudly enough for Mangas to hear, that the prisoner would not survive until morning. The soldiers heated bayonets in the fire and pressed them against Mangas's legs as he slept. When he moved in reaction to the pain, the soldiers declared he was trying to escape and executed him. He was 70 years old. The soldiers then cut off his head, boiled it to remove the flesh, and sent the skull to a phrenologist in New York. The American government never filed criminal charges against anyone involved. This was called an incident. The incident of killing a 70-year-old peace leader during a negotiation. Loco, the leader who tried peace and learned there was none. Loco was a Mimbres Apache leader who genuinely believed that peaceful coexistence with Americans was possible and spent years trying to prove it. He settled on the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, tried to adapt to rules imposed by the government, and kept his people out of the conflicts other Apache groups continued waging. In April of 1882, Geronimo and Nana invaded the San Carlos Reservation with armed warriors and literally forced Loco and his people to leave at gunpoint, under threat of death for anyone who refused. Loco did not want to go. His people did not want to go, but they had no choice. During the forced withdrawal, the American army attacked the group, killing dozens of people. The Mexican government attacked the group at Tres Castillos, killing dozens more. Loco, who had tried peace, watched his people massacred by 2 armies for being in the wrong place because of a decision that was not his. The message the American continent sent to Apache who tried peace was consistent. There was no safe place, no right choice, no reward for the attempt. Ju, the lord of the Sierra Madre Mountains. Ju was the leader of the Kaytennae Apache, the most isolated and independent of all Chiricahua groups, and operated mainly in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, terrain so hostile that the American army never seriously attempted to penetrate it. Ju was a close ally of Geronimo and participated in various joint campaigns, but in the Sierra Madre, his dominion was absolute. The Mexican army tried for years to eliminate Ju without measurable success. The Sierra Madre Mountains were to Ju what the Dragoon Mountains were to Cochise, a natural fortress that enemies could not take because they could not even get close. Ju died in 1883, not in battle, but drowned in a river after falling from his horse, reportedly while intoxicated. For a man who had survived decades of warfare against 2 armies, the irony of his fate is almost surgical. The military historians who spent decades trying to understand how to capture him must have been speechless when they heard the cause of death. Chato, the Apache scout who won on both sides. Chato was a Chiricahua warrior who, in 1883, led a devastating raid through Arizona and New Mexico that killed 26 people in 10 days before vanishing back into the Sierra Madre. The American army did not know what had happened until it was over. 1 year later, Chato was an army scout, tracking his former companions. Not out of ideological betrayal, out of pure calculation. Chato understood before many others that the war was lost and that working for the American army was the best survival option available. He became one of the most effective scouts in the campaign against Geronimo. After Geronimo surrendered in 1886, the American government, as thanks for services rendered, deported Chato and all other Apache scouts who had served the army loyally to Florida as prisoners of war. Alongside the Chiricahua who had fought against them, the American government deported both enemies and allies to the same prison camp. Admirable consistency. Lozen, the warrior woman. No school textbook mentions. Lozen was Victorio's sister and one of the most extraordinary people in the Apache Wars, and for most of the 20th century, American textbooks simply pretended she did not exist. She was a warrior in combat, a healer for the group, and had, according to documented testimony from multiple Apache warriors of the era, an almost supernatural ability to detect the location and movement of enemies. Victorio said of her, in a documented statement, "With Lozen beside me, I need nothing else." When Victorio was killed at Tres Castillos in 1880, Lozen was not present because she was escorting a pregnant woman and her baby through the desert, alone from New Mexico to the reservation. She crossed hundreds of miles of enemy territory carrying a mother and a newborn without being detected. She then joined Geronimo, continued fighting, and was captured with him in 1886. She died as a prisoner of war in Alabama. In 1889 of tuberculosis. She was probably around 40 years old. There's no record of the American government offering any recognition. Eskiminzin, the massacre survivor who rebuilt everything. In April of 1871, a group of American citizens from Tucson, together with Mexican Papago soldiers, attacked a peaceful Apache Aravaipa camp while they slept. It was Eskiminzin's camp, which was under the formal protection of the American army. The attack lasted 1 hour. When it ended, 144 Apache were dead, the vast majority women and children. 28 children were kidnapped and sold as servants. Eskiminzin lost his family. The American government arrested 108 people for participating in the massacre. The local jury, composed of Tucson citizens, acquitted everyone in 19 minutes. 19 minutes to acquit 108 people for the murder of 144. Mathematically impossible to even read the charges in 19 minutes. Eskiminzin later rebuilt his community, tried farming, was imprisoned without trial a second time years later, and kept going. The massacre became known as the Camp Grant Massacre and is considered one of the most documented episodes of violence against indigenous people in the American Southwest. Skinya, the warrior who broke Cochise's peace. After Cochise died in 1874 and the peace he had negotiated began to unravel at the hands of the American government, which reduced and divided the Chiricahua Reservation, several warriors refused to accept the new conditions. Skinya was one of those warriors, a brother-in-law of Cochise, who opposed the successor chosen by the family and led groups that continued resisting reservation restrictions. In 1876, when the American government tried to force the Chiricahua to relocate to the San Carlos Reservation, Skinya led groups that refused to go. The San Carlos Reservation was known among the Apache as the hottest, driest, and most disease-ridden place in Arizona, which was saying something in a territory that was already hot, dry, and disease-ridden by default. The American agent John Clum, who was 21 years old at the time and had no relevant experience in indigenous diplomacy, was put in charge of overseeing the compulsory transfer. Clum later wrote a memoir. The Apache, who were forced to San Carlos, were not given an equivalent editorial opportunity. Kaytennae, the warrior who survived Alcatraz. Kaytennae was a young Chiricahua warrior leader who in 1883 was arrested by the American Army and sent to Alcatraz in San Francisco as an intimidation measure to show other Apache what happened to those who resisted. Alcatraz, at that time, was not the famous federal prison for movies. It was a maximum security federal military installation on an island in San Francisco Bay. The plan was to break Kaytennae psychologically through isolation, climate, and prison conditions. Kaytennae spent 2 years at Alcatraz and returned to Arizona in 1885, not as a broken man, but as a voluntary Army scout, convinced that armed resistance had no future. He became one of the most effective scouts and was instrumental in the final campaign against Geronimo. The Army sent a warrior to the worst prison in the country to break him and got back an experienced and convinced ally. American strategic planning in that century was, on average, inspired. The Battle of Apache Pass, the day Geronimo saw fire from the sky. In July of 1862, at Apache Pass in Arizona, a group of Chiricahua warriors led by Cochise and Mangas, Coloradas set up an ambush for a Union Army contingent commanded by Captain Thomas Roberts. It was a typical Apache ambush: elevated position, total visibility, pre-planned retreat routes, warriors invisible among the rocks. What the Apache did not expect was that Captain Roberts had 2 mountain howitzers, portable field artillery. When the Army opened fire with artillery in a mountain canyon, it was the first time most Apache warriors had seen exploding projectiles. Cochise and Mangas Coloradas withdrew their forces. Roberts reached the water spring at the pass. Geronimo, who was present at the battle, described the howitzers years later as the thunder the Army used. The battle was an American tactical victory, but the Apache continued controlling the surrounding territory for another decade. Having artillery is useful. Knowing how to use the terrain is better. The San Carlos Reservation, the paradise that was not. In 1875, the American government decided to consolidate all Apache groups into a single reservation to facilitate control. It chose San Carlos in Arizona, a desert plain near the Gila River, so inhospitable that even indigenous peoples native to the territory had difficulty surviving there. Temperatures reached 118 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. The terrain was incompatible with agriculture. Water was scarce. Diseases, especially malaria, regularly decimated the inhabitants. The San Carlos Reservation agent was frequently replaced due to corruption. The ration distribution system was organized so that agents could easily divert food and supplies the government sent to the Apache, selling them on the outside market. Superintendent John Clum later declared that San Carlos was hell in the format of an indigenous reservation. This was the same person who supervised the forced relocation of dozens of Apache groups there. The degree of self-awareness here is open to debate. The Apache scout system, when the Empire hires the enemy. The American Army had a logical problem. How do you track Apache warriors in territory that only the Apache knew well enough to survive? The solution was to hire Apache to track other Apache. The American Army's Apache Scouts program employed hundreds of warriors from different groups throughout the 1870s and 80s. They were trackers of incomparable skill who knew the terrain, the behavioral patterns of fleeing groups, and the water sources that regular soldiers would never find on their own. Without the Apache Scouts, the campaign against Geronimo would likely have taken another decade. The Apache Scouts were essential to Geronimo's final capture in 1886. The reward, as already mentioned, was compulsory deportation to Florida as prisoners of war, alongside the same enemies they had helped capture. General Nelson Miles, who commanded the final campaign, was celebrated as a national hero. The Apache Scouts who made his victory possible were sent to prison camps. The distribution of credit in the American Army was, let us say, creative. The Skeleton Canyon Conference. The end that did not feel like an end. In September of 1886, in a canyon in Arizona called Skeleton Canyon, Geronimo met General Nelson Miles for the final surrender. Miles promised Geronimo that he and his people would be taken to Florida, and then permitted to return to Arizona to live in peace. Miles said this, knowing he had no authorization from the federal government to make such a promise. Geronimo specifically asked whether this was a real promise. Miles confirmed it was. The promise was broken immediately. The Chiricahua were taken to Florida, and then to Alabama, then to Oklahoma. They never returned to Arizona as a group. President Grover Cleveland later became so furious with the surrender terms that he nearly sent Geronimo to trial for murder, which would have violated the surrender terms Miles had promised. The American government was almost angry enough to execute a man for believing a promise that the government's own agent had made. The logic was internal, just not logic we recognize. The Apache Wars by the numbers, the math nobody likes to see. The Apache Wars lasted intermittently from 1849, with the first serious conflicts after the Mexican cession, until 1886 with Geronimo's surrender. 37 years. The American Army lost approximately 800 soldiers killed in combat during this period. The number of American civilians killed in conflicts with Apache groups is estimated between 1,000 and 1,500. The Apache suffered devastating population losses. The Chiricahua population that may have had 4,000 to 5,000 people was reduced to fewer than 500 when Geronimo surrendered. Combat deaths, diseases on reservations, civilian massacres like Camp Grant. The financial cost to the American Army was estimated at over $40 million of the time, equivalent to over $1 billion today, to capture, in the end, fewer than 80 warriors in the field. The cost per captured Apache warrior was equivalent to the budget of a small American city of the era. Operational efficiency was remarkable, if you count from the bottom up. General George Crook, the man who actually understood the Apache. George Crook was the American general that Apache leaders themselves respected, which, in the context of the Apache Wars, was the most improbable compliment imaginable. Crook arrived in Arizona in 1871 with an approach radically different from previous generals. Instead of trying to defeat the Apache with numerical superiority and artillery, he used Apache scouts to track other Apache and treated surrendering groups with genuine respect. He succeeded where others repeatedly failed. In 1882, Crook was sent back to Arizona after Geronimo left the reservation again and managed to convince Geronimo and his people to surrender in 1885. Geronimo later changed his mind and escaped with 36 followers. Washington blamed Crook. Crook resigned in disagreement with the federal policy of collectively punishing the Apache. He was replaced by Miles, who then broke every promise he made at the surrender. The man who worked was fired. The man who broke every promise was promoted. The pattern was consistent. The Bloody Tanks Massacre. The slaughter that inaugurated an era. In March of 1864, American trader King Woolsey invited a group of Tonto Apache to a peace meeting at Bloody Tanks, a location in Arizona. The meeting was a trap. Woolsey had distributed pinole, a roasted corn flour mixed with strychnine, and when the Apache began eating, Woolsey gave the signal and hidden men opened fire. 19 Apache were killed. Woolsey described the event in letters as the best way to solve the Apache problem. Woolsey was never prosecuted. The Arizona Territory named him a member of the first territorial legislature. The man who organized a poisoned banquet to kill indigenous people at a peace meeting was elected as a representative of the people. American democracy in territorial Arizona operated with a very particular sense of who constituted the people to be represented. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when Mexico sold the Apache without asking. In 1848, after the Mexican-American War, Mexico and the United States signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, by which Mexico ceded over 850,000 square miles of territory, including what is now California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado. In this territory lived Apache groups who had never been governed by Mexico in any effective way, and who certainly were not consulted about the treaty. Two countries signed a document transferring sovereignty over a territory that neither one effectively controlled, inhabited by people who recognized the authority of neither. The Apache learned about the treaty the same way someone learns when two neighbors decide to divide their yard without telling them, through the new owners who showed up trying to dictate rules. Article 11 of the treaty even obligated the United States to prevent Apache from raiding into Mexico. The United States failed to fulfill that article for 38 years. Mickey Free, the boy whose kidnapping destroyed a generation. In January of 1861, children were taken from a ranch in Arizona. The Army blamed Cochise. It was false. The kidnapping was carried out by a different group, the Coyotero Apache. But Lieutenant Bascom was sent to confront Cochise anyway. The result was the Bascom Affair, which became the 11-year Apache War, which became decades of conflict. The boy kidnapped at that ranch was named Felix Ward. He was raised among the Coyotero Apache, learned their language and customs, and decades later became one of the most important Army Scouts, now known as Mickey Free. He was physically unmistakable. He had a glass eye and red hair, the result of his Irish ancestry through his adoptive father. Mickey Free served as interpreter and scout in some of the most important campaigns against the Apache, including negotiations with Geronimo. The boy whose kidnapping, wrongly attributed to Cochise, triggered 25 years of war, ended up working for the army that conducted that war. History is rarely linear. Al Sieber, the chief of scouts who never admitted being wounded. Al Sieber was the civilian chief of the Apache Scouts of the American Army, and probably one of the most injured men in the history of the American West to continue functioning normally. A Civil War veteran, Sieber was wounded in combat 28 times throughout his career in Arizona. 28. At various times, he was shot in the neck, the head, the ankle, the leg, and other places it would be imprudent to detail. The wounded ankle eventually made him permanently limp, but he stayed in the field. The Apache scouts who worked with Sieber had genuine respect for him, which was rare, considering that he represented the same structure that confined their relatives to reservations. Sieber died in 1907 during road construction in Arizona when a loose rock crushed him. He survived 28 combat wounds. A rock killed him. There is something philosophical about that which I leave for the viewer to process: the final deportation, when the American victory felt like defeat. In September of 1886, when the train carrying Chiricahua prisoners left Arizona bound for Florida, there were approximately 438 people aboard. Among them were warriors who had fought against the American Army, families who had not participated in any conflict, and the Apache scouts themselves who had served the Army loyally and helped capture Geronimo. The American government made no distinction. It took everyone. The Chiricahua spent their first years in Florida, where the humid climate was so different from the Arizona desert that deaths from tuberculosis were devastating. They were then transferred to Alabama, then to Oklahoma, where they remained as prisoners of war for 27 years. In 1913, the survivors finally received the option of staying in Mescalero territory in New Mexico or remaining at Fort Sill. None of them received the option of returning to Arizona. The territory the American government promised Cochise in 1872 was dissolved shortly after his death. Promises in the 19th century American West had limited shelf life. Fort Sill in the final years, prisoners of war in the 20th century. The Chiricahua Apache were formal prisoners of war of the United States from 1886 until 1913, 27 years. During this period, the world witnessed the birth of cinema, the assassination of President McKinley, the invention of the airplane by the Wright brothers, the first commercial radio broadcast, and the beginning and near end of the American Progressive Era. And the Chiricahua remained prisoners of war in Oklahoma. At Fort Sill, Geronimo became an unlikely celebrity, as already described. Other members of the group tried to adapt. Some converted to Christianity, some sent children to federal Indian schools. The Chiricahua population continued to decline from disease. When the formal prisoner of war status was finally lifted in 1913, there were fewer than 300 survivors of the original group of over 4,000 people. The American government called the end of prisoner status the resolution of the Apache problem. 300 survivors from 4,000 was, from any angle you look at it, a very permanent solution. The Apache legacy today, what was not erased. Today there are approximately 15 Apache groups recognized by the American federal government, with reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. The White Mountain Apache Nation in Arizona has territory of over 2,600 square miles, runs one of the most sustainable forestry operations in the American Southwest, and manages the Honda Resort and Casino. The San Carlos Apache manage water rights on the Gila River that are still disputed with the state of Arizona today because water in Arizona is more valuable than gold. The Fort Sill Apache, direct descendants of the Chiricahua who were prisoners of war, only received their own reservation in New Mexico in 1984, 98 years after being deported as prisoners of war. The name Geronimo continues to be shouted by American paratroopers. Arizona has a highway, a city, and several schools named Apache. The history the American government tried to erase has been partially retold through the very systems that tried to erase it. This is not forgiveness, it is documented survival. Naiche, the last hereditary Chiricahua chief. Naiche was the son of Cochise, and the last hereditary chief of the Chiricahua Apache. Unlike Geronimo, who was a military leader chosen for his competence, Naiche had the ceremonial and political authority that came from direct lineage from the greatest Chiricahua leader. When Cochise died in 1874, Naiche was approximately 19 years old. He was too young to maintain authority alone during a time of crisis, and other leaders like Taza, his older brother, and later Geronimo filled the vacuum. Naiche participated in Geronimo's campaigns not as a subordinate, but as a political leader whose presence legitimized the group's actions. He was captured and deported with Geronimo in 1886. He spent 27 years as a prisoner of war. At Fort Sill, Naiche converted to Presbyterianism and began painting, creating visual records of Apache life that are now in museums. The son of Cochise spent his final years painting the memories of a world the American government tried to destroy, on conditional freedom, in a prison camp in Oklahoma. The Carlisle Federal Indian School, when killing the child to save the Indian was public policy. In 1879, American Captain Richard Pratt founded the Indian Industrial Boarding School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. With a slogan, he publicly stated himself, "Kill the Indian and save the man." The idea was to take indigenous children from their families, send them to schools far from their home territory, forbid them from speaking their languages, wearing their clothes, practicing their religions, using their names, and force complete assimilation into American culture. Apache children were sent to Carlisle.
They died from diseases, from homesickness, from tuberculosis, in a climate completely different from the desert where they were born. Between 1879 and 1918, over 10,000 children from 140 distinct nations passed through Carlisle. The school cemetery has 118 graves of children who never went home. In 2021, the American Army finally returned the remains of some of these children to their families, 142 years later. American bureaucracy works on a geological timescale when the subject is historical reparation. Geronimo, the autobiography that was not quite his own. In 1906, 1 year after participating in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, Geronimo told his story to ethnologist Stephen Melville Barrett, who transcribed and published it as the book Geronimo, His Own Story. The book was a bestseller. The American government initially refused authorization for publication and only relented when Roosevelt himself intervened. Which is curious because the book documented in Geronimo's own voice the massacres, the broken promises, the deportations, the deaths of his family. Every fact the government preferred the American public not know was there, narrated by the man who lived it. Geronimo died in 1909 before seeing the book's full reach. The autobiography of a prisoner of war, documenting the crimes of the government that held him prisoner, was published with the blessing of the president of that same government. America is complicated in this specific way with some regularity. What they did not tell us. The closing. The army that could not defeat the Apache on the battlefield defeated them slowly through confinement, disease, starvation, and forced assimilation. Geronimo died a prisoner. Lozen died a prisoner. Nietzsche survived as a prisoner for 27 years. The Apache scouts who made the American victory possible were deported alongside their enemies. The children were sent to schools where they were punished for speaking their mother tongues. The treaties were all broken. The reservations were reduced when valuable resources were discovered on them. The history told in American school textbooks for 100 years was the story of a civilized country taming a wild territory. The real history is that of warriors who defended their territory for decades against forces that vastly outnumbered and out-resourced them using intelligence, knowledge of terrain, and a resilience that no army with artillery could break. They did not lose because they were inferior. They lost because they were fewer. And even being fewer, they made the army of the most powerful country on the continent spend 37 years, $40 million, and over 800 military lives to win. That is not defeat. That is one of the most documented acts of resistance in American military history.